episode of Frank Perspectives, and I'm delighted to introduce my guest for today, Michael Andrade. Michael is a veteran banker with more than 25 years of banking experience. He was head of agri lending for a long time at HDFC Bank, with responsibilities of retail agri, commodity finance, agri supply chain, and financial inclusion. He was also a steering committee member of AgriFin, a World Bank Group entity, and also a member of the National Committee on Food Processing of CII. He's currently the founder of Samaru, and Samaru is a technology-enabled value chain and financial services company, and they are working towards inclusion of farmers, rural communities, and underserved entrepreneurs, trying to bring them to the modern value chain. So very warm welcome to Michael, and thank you so much for taking the time and speaking to us today. The pandemic situation currently is a very, very challenging situation for many economic sectors, as well as for the banks. How have you seen historically, in your experience, such pandemics and such major disruptions impacting agriculture, and more importantly, impacting the agri lending book for the banks?
Yes, Amit. Pleasure being here and happy to share my views. So, to begin with, agriculture is immune to shocks. Okay? Every year you have something or the other that shocks the industry. So let me just take you through, the last 4 or 5 years. 2015, okay, 2015 we had a major drought here, and our cereal or food grain production was about 250 million metric ton. I'm taking food grains and cereals because that enjoys the bulk of bank credit compared to the vegetable segment or the horticulture segment or even animal husbandry segment. So I'm focusing more on cereals since our topic is on bank credit. Now, 2016, come to 2016, good harvest, good monsoons, good harvest, but the industry was shocked by demonetization. Nevertheless, you had 273 million metric ton of production. So the growth rate continued. 18-19, major drought across central India, and our total food grain production in that year was 285 metric ton, continues to climb. 2019, same story, again drought in Karnataka, Kerala and those parts, and we clocked 291 million metric tons. So if you look at this pattern, when you come to 2021, we've had a good kharif. The Rabi harvest has been done. It has not come to the market, but yes, it's done. So my guess is that the pattern will continue. And 21, if you go to the next kharif season, the rains are expected to be good. Supply chain bottlenecks in terms of seeds and fertilizers. The message from the ground is that it's not such a big problem. Okay. So I don't think so there should be any problem in the food grain production during this period. Even if you see the latest locust attack, there is no standing crop for food grains at the moment. What is impacted is mainly horticulture, plantations, and feed fodder. So on the production side, we should be doing okay. We should continue with the same growth rate. When it comes to prices, throughout this period, of course, we had a major drop in prices. Prices came off quite a bit from 2012 to 2014. But from 15 to the current period, prices have been steadily rising across all categories of food. So we don't have a problem with prices either. Then you come to the inputs. Inputs, yes, they have been growing by 5 to 7%, vis-a-vis prices and output growing by 2 to 3%. So yes, there is a squeeze on the margins as far as farmers are concerned. My gut feel is, it is probably the gross margin for a crop has dropped from say about 50% to about 45%. Is my estimate back of the envelope calculation. I may be wrong, but that's my rough calculation.
Estimate, yeah.
Now, when you look at loan servicing requirements, if you look at the cash credit or the Kisan credit card, which is the working capital piece, you need about 14% of gross margin to service that. And if you look at term loans, that is longer term period loans, you would require about 20 to 25% of the margin.
Mhm.
So there, I mean, it's less than 50% of what a crop generates.
Mm.
So technically, there should not be a problem in servicing loans.
Mm.
But the challenge here is not the technical aspects. The problem on loan servicing comes from excess leverage that is given to large farmers.
Mhm.
So farmers are lent more than what is required, number one. And number two is a lot of that money is diverted away from agriculture.
Mhm.
If I look at, there was an old statistics in 2012 that mentioned 56% of loans to large farmers gets diverted away from agriculture.
Mm. That's a significant portion.
Yes. Whereas when it comes to small farmers, that percentage drops to about 35%.
Mm.
Okay. So it's an old statistic. I'm not sure how it looks right now, but that's the fact of the matter.
Mm.
And these are the ones that cause the problem to the banking
Mm.
system. So when you look at this, what really is the impact going to be on this credit squeeze that may happen in a farmer's cash flows is that the loans that are in your 270 plus DPD, days past due bucket, they will flow into NPAs.
Correct.
Okay, because of this problem.
Mm.
I don't see any other major repercussions. So these are loans of farmers that have not serviced their exposure loans in each of the preceding 3 crop cycles.
Mm.
So they already had 3 crop cycles, and now they are 270 days past due. So the chances of them, of a bank recovering a significant portion of that is reduced completely. So this is where the challenge is. Not technically, if you look at it, I don't see any major problem arising. Also, you have to understand that agricultural loans are crop loans get a leeway of 360 days before it can be classified as a non-performing loan, as against 90 days for any other business.
Mm. So very significant point you make, Michael. What you are saying is that even if you factor in the one crop impact during this period, the real impact in terms of increasing delinquency for agri lending book will be from borrowers who are already under stress for various reasons, even prior to this impact came in.
Exactly.
And another very important point you make, which gives us a lot of hope, is that historically the impact on agriculture have been relatively benign, and agriculture has seen growth despite all the disruptions. But there is one observation that I have, Michael, which I'm sure a lot of people are also asking: what happens on account of this reverse migration which is now taking place? Will this have a significant impact on the agriculture?
Yes, but the reverse migration from cities is not so much of a problem, to my mind. The reverse migration away from the progressive agricultural states, like Punjab, Haryana, that will cause some problems for these states, the progressive states, and that will cause some overcrowding in the states from where they come from. That is, Eastern UP, Bihar, West Bengal, places like that. Jharkhand.
So how does these larger production centers and progressive states like Punjab, Haryana, you mentioned, how do they handle this challenge? Do you think this is temporary, or whatever labor is moving out over a period of time, maybe a quarter or two, they will move back, and this is therefore can be overcome? Or do you see that there is a longer period of impact?
So labor as a problem, as an issue, has been around, for the last 7-8 years, not more. And you had all kinds of tactics being adopted by farmers to attract labor. And this has happened ever since things like Narega things happened. So farmers, the labor rates went up, and people didn't have to migrate too far. So as a result, the level of mechanization has been increased. We've already reached a 50% level of mechanization in these places in terms of cropping. Okay. Now, mechanization in terms of post-harvest management, moving grains from farms to processors in a mechanized way, that is the one that is going to be affected right now, and that is where we can see more investments.
So government has also come out with a lot of interventions at their end. So whether it is proposed amendment to the Essentials Commodities Act, where they're trying to say some of the categories like edible oils, seeds, pulses, onion, potato may be moved out of the purview, or going beyond, permitting farmers to go beyond the APMC and giving them the option to choose the market, right? Or strengthening the ENAM infrastructure, or the farm gate boost to the 1 lakh crore investment, and also a similar investment in the allied industry. How will this play out in terms of boosting the agriculture growth rate? And why I ask this is because you mentioned mechanization, especially in the post-harvest aspect of it. Does it solve that issue to a large extent?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at the brick and mortar supply chains today, you have a mandi on one side and you have the wholesale market at the other end. Number one, both are challenges to social distancing. And as long as the virus is around, everyone will want to stay away from that. Number two, we talked about labor. So there's a lot of labor required. It's a high cost activity, and that will not be available. And number three, for these kind of the participants in these brick and mortar supply chains are largely smaller players, SME type of players, and there's going to be a major credit crunch with them. As a result, trade credit to the farmers will be a little tight. If you look at any cereal food grain crop, there are two phases when farmer requires money for the crop. One is sowing, where 50% of the investment of the crop goes into sowing for leveling the field, seeds, fertilizer, that's it. And the other part is harvesting, where another 30% of the investment into a crop goes. So sowing is taken care of by the input side of retail, and harvesting is generally taken care of by the RTRs and commission agents. And more often than not, these two are interrelated. So it's the same person who has a input shop who also has a mandi license. This is how it works. So this is going to get a bit constrained. Having said that, the requirement for mechanization because of labor at a farm gate is going to be a very attractive investment for anyone who's ready to participate over there, because the margin or the spread between farm gate to the APMC, okay, is a play of almost 10% on the turnover of the okay. From the APMC to the processor, the play is only 3% of the turnover. Okay, so if you look at 10% of the, I'm talking about cost of gunny bags, cost of labor, transportation, multiple movements within the mandi. There is added on commissions and hidden commissions and all kinds of stuff that happen. If you mechanize this, say farm gate mechanization, so you put up a 200 metric ton silo, which has has all the processing equipment attached to it. A 200 metric ton silo can pass through 1,000 metric tons, okay, during season. Comes in 5 days, hold off to the off-taker. But the procedure is totally mechanized. The farmer comes with his trolley, the trolley goes on the weighbridge, it's unloaded into a hopper, and it is through, conveyors, what you call elevators. It moved into a cyclone chamber where the dust is removed. It goes to destoning chamber where the stones are removed, and you get absolutely clean material into the bins. Okay, and you have multiple bins. This equipment will cost you about 35 to 50 lakhs. And if you finance it and you write it off over 7 years, the cost of moving grains, including this finance cost, from the farmer to the processor, end to end, comes down from your 12-13% to about 3 or 4%.
Significant.
Significant. And that benefit can be shared between the farmer, the entrepreneur who's ready to, put up the
farm gate infrastructure. Yeah.
And the processor who then does not have to reprocess and clean produce as a cost.
So overall input quality at the processor level goes much better, which is possibly a constraint for the farmers today, and that's why the dependence on multiple layers.
Exactly. So and then if you put all this mechanization in, it's a like I said, 40 to 50 lakh investment over a 7-year period, and the manufacturers come and they'll do an AMC should anything go wrong. So that investment pays for itself in a much shorter period. Okay. We take 7 years because you could have 1 or 2 shocks in the geography during those periods. So technically it would pay off in 5 years, but you take a margin. So that is just one aspect of, the initiative from the government on farm gate infrastructure. And there could be similar stuff for fresh produce, for horticulture. You have for apples now, you have in the village, they have started putting micro waxing plants. So all this kind of stuff can happen at farm gate, and you could have this movement straight to the retailers or to the processor. And once you do that, okay, you build in your payment and settlement system and your lending system around this. So you have mechanization of movement of the supply chain, and with that you do digitization of your supply chain. And you have all this data flowing, and it's so much easier now to do. You can do lending, micro bill discounting. You can digitize the entire supply chain and finance.
So it changes the entire ecosystem of agri-lending.
It changes the entire ecosystem of agri-lending. It creates new margins for people who are participating in the value chain. And it requires a new mindset and a new approach. And it requires the investment that I mentioned, and the government has provided the initial impetus.
One area where you touched upon, Michael, when you mentioned apples there, but I would want your perspective on how does the perishable supply chain gets impacted. Of course, there is another 500 crores which the government has set for Operation Green and encouraging the logistics and some subsidies for perishables. How is the dynamics of perishables? Because we have seen a lot of price fluctuations and movement constraints, of course, warehousing constraints historically in this particular segment. How does that supply chain modernize?
So perishables, we have a brilliant perishable supply chain in the dairy system. Okay. The dairy system is one where the farmer gets almost 70% of the milk price into his pocket because of the efficiency of the system. Right? The only thing is that it is a single, what they call SKU. Okay. It's one type of product.
One type of product.
Maybe buffalo milk, cow milk, they have those variations, and then fat content and all when it finally goes. But at the production side, it's just buffalo milk or cow milk. Now again, fresh produce, you have to divide it into things like onion, potato, tomato. So those have a particular dynamic.
Correct.
And then all the other fresh produce, they behave very similar to dairy. Because
so shelf life is different within perishable category.
Okay, on the production side, you can harvest 100 kgs every day and bring it to the market. Just like you harvest 10 liters of milk every day and bring it to the collection center. You can. So on the production side, it's very similar. Okay, you have pack houses and you have a lot of low-cost technology then to keep it at ambient temperature, closer to the villages. So there's a lot of that happening. What we don't have is after that when it goes to the markets. Okay, so you have some form of modern retail, but that's small. Remember, 50-60% of urban population are, low income group. Someone with a solution over there can attract 50% of this market.
Mm.
Now, when you look at fresh produce, I said 10% or 12% for food grains from farm to processing.
Mm.
With fresh produce, considering wastage, considering the challenges in the supply chain, that play is 35%.
Mm.
So there's a huge margin to play with.
Mm.
If you get, so the key is getting a solution to retail fresh produce effectively to the low income groups. Everyone's targeted at the high income groups, where the volumes are very low.
Mm.
But post COVID-19, someone needs to study how low income groups are purchasing their vegetables and what is their desire, what can be the behavioral change over there, and address that market. Because that is huge. Because today what happens is, because of small volumes in the high income groups, all the ag tech companies that are sourcing from farmers are being very selective. So the farmer brings 100 kgs of, say, bhindi. Okay. They will select good quality bhindi, keep about 50 kgs, and the remaining 50 kg he has to take to the mandi or sell it in the market. That makes sense. You should be able to absorb 100% of what the farmer brings. So perishables is a very, very complicated business because of the number of products that come in and the multiple ways it reaches the consumers. Okay, and the different consumer segments. Okay, but I'm sure that there is the 35% play, and somebody who can crack this market will be doing all the vegetable growers a big favor.
And more importantly, you very specifically mentioned from an opportunity space, with of course government support coming in, infrastructure expected to improve, etc. The ecosystem is getting ready, and you can start looking at bottom of the pyramid, low income group segment for this kind of a supply system.
Absolutely.
Which is very, very informal as of today, with multiple layers, different sizes of vendors selling the perishables.
Correct.
There is one historical challenge that I have seen, and all of us would have studied also, is the fragmented agriculture in India. Indian agriculture being average landholding being very, very small, relatively 60-70% of the farmers are marginal farmers or small farmers. This pandemic, does it change any of the dynamics in terms of the fragmentation? And I'll tell you why I'm asking this question is because you talked about mechanization opportunities which are going to happen in the supply chain. And we discussed two important ones, one on cereals and one on the perishables, right? Does this fragmentation restrict for a small farmer to put up these kind of investments? Or are there going to be new models of consolidation which will arise, which can solve this problem of fragmentation?
Small farmers in India cultivate 40% of the land, and they almost have 55-60% of the output, if I recollect one report correctly. So they are definitely more efficient. We can't wish away the small farms, but consolidation in terms of organization into societies, into FPOs, into informal groups is the way to go. So I'm saying if you were to aggregate one village of about 200 households, okay, in a dry state like Rajasthan, that would be 1,000 acres. In an irrigated state, that would be about 700-800 acres. That's a reasonable size to mechanize, to use drones, to use drip irrigation, to use precision services. Okay. It has to be consolidated so that the cost of these services and cost of the equipment can be shared. Cost, of course, is something that needs to be financed. And when you aggregate it, finance also becomes easier. So I think aggregation is definitely the way to go. Again, I go back to the example of milk cooperatives. They've done a damn good job, okay, of aggregating and making that a viable business model. I think that is the model to go. At a village level, you have a milk collection center. You have 40-50 farmers who come in every day and pour their milk, and they get their payments over there. and they get their loans from there, they get their feed from there, they get everything from there. So similar model, maybe the same extension of the same set of people, okay, could aggregate about 800 to 1,000 acres at every village. And that's decent.
So we already have a template in milk.
We already have a template.
We already have, and possibly this, disruption acts as a catalyst now to push for these kind of changes in the other areas as well.
Yes, I think what is needed is to stay away from siloed thinking when you aggregate, and get the aggregated mass to be shared with all the service providers. What you'll have is some kind of tech solutions similar to Uberization and or e-commerce, some hybrid tech solutions around that to share the platform on an aggregated basis.
Agri intermediation and agri infrastructure support models can also be a very good space for the startups to come in.
Yes, definitely, but let us not underestimate the use of manpower, okay, to get this going, because there are physical goods that need to be managed.
True.
Okay. There's commodity to be collected, there are inputs that need to be supplied, there is farms that need to be checked from stage to stage, because you still have accuracy from satellite imagery is still way too expensive and way inaccurate at this point in time. So there is a lot of manpower that is required on the ground. Pure tech will not do, but yeah, it can drive, it can manage this manpower, and it can move physical goods as well as digitize on the information. So that's pretty much the model. It will be high touch and high tech.
And that is good. And high tech, okay.
High touch and high tech.
Primarily what you're saying is that there is a need for a hybrid model which leverages tech to the extent possible.
Yeah.
Right? And over a period of time, my assumption would be that this will increase. As we grow possibly into another 5-10 years, this will increase. But as the thing stands today, a hybrid model, high touch and high tech.
I think the investment in high touch and high tech goes together at this point in time to create that change till the touch part of it gets replaced by farmers, what you call a do-it-yourself.
So that brings me to the last question, Michael. With all these changes happening, and you have already spelled out a lot of silver lining, even in these challenging times for agriculture. Does it change anything from an agri lending policy perspective for the banks? Do they change the way they are evaluating now the methodologies of assessment for lending to agriculture?
So I think the ground is set by RBI through co-lending models. Okay, so co-lending would be the way to go rather than creating brick and mortar distribution by banks. It is too expensive to run brick and mortar distribution for agri lending. Yes, I mean, if you look at a 2 or 3 man or 4 man branch in a rural area that has to service about 800 or 1,000 customers, the cost of your acquisition cost is about 25,000 rupees per customer. Your servicing cost is about 5,000 rupees a customer. So you need to look at a customer that is about a ticket size of 4 to 5 lakhs. When you look at a ticket size of 4 to 5 lakhs, you would get 4 or 5 potential customers per village. That means if you want 800 customers, you'll have to reach out to at least 50 villages. Now, when you reach out to 50 villages, these 4 people, are they going to run the branch, or they're going to go to those villages to collect money at the house? So the way you're looking at it is around aggregation, around technology, and tech intermediaries, or the intermediaries, the new startups, companies that come in, over time as these models settle down and manage risk better, manage costs better. Banks would be happy to get into co-lending models rather than creating their own brick and mortar setups. No amount of digitization, will enable you to lend to 90% of the farmers who own 1 hectare of land. And if you can't lend to that bunch, then you're always going to be very high cost.
I'm seeing here, based on what you've said, increasing mechanization, better consolidation, aggregation, does two things. One is, over a period of time, the data that the banks require to assess will improve reliability on the data. Instead of just looking at the acreage and multiplying it by the crop and the cash flow from for assessing an agri loan, right? Possibly those methods can be more scientific over a period of time, and also in the current space, more bias in the lending towards capexes can be an opportunity.
Actually, both. I mean, definitely more data, better assessment of the needs of farmers. But the need of the hour is for both, for effective working capital and also term credit. Okay. Products would need to be redesigned. Right now we have a Kisan credit card that was designed in 1998, more than 25 years, silver jubilee for the product. There's no new product out there. Okay, so data and technology can redesign some of these products that make it more effective for farmers to buy better quality seeds, let's say, be more effective in the way they use the inputs, minimize the use of inputs, verify the inputs, what they're using, have micro insurance at each stage of the crop. So you could have micro insurance at the seed stage. So if the rains are delayed, you just get a fresh bag of seeds under your insurance rather than not growing at all. So micro insurance at each stage of the crop. All this redesigning can happen with data. Okay, and that would also mean that the money lent is more effectively used for cropping and doesn't get diverted. Right. So these are the things on the working capital side, and all the bioengineering around seeds and all those things coming up to manage things like climate change, all require decent investment in working capital and also know-how. So all that needs to be financed in a very effective way using technology and data that is available. Payment systems are beautifully developed, so all this is the tech required is very simple. Okay, it's not very complicated. That is on this side. On the investment side, I think it would be more of a service model that will evolve, where farmers will avail services. They will should not necessarily own assets, because a small farm cannot, provide adequate capacity utilization for mechanized assets that go into mechanization. So it will be more of a shared economy that will come in on the asset side. But again, data is the driver. And today, the only way to collect data today is to have people on the ground collecting.
That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much again for taking the time out and sharing such deep perspectives on agriculture across this spectrum. And the best part that has come out of our interaction and discussion today is the silver lining that agriculture possibly will hold state much, much better compared to the other economic segments. And we still have a larger reliance on agriculture to contribute to our GDP, and it can possibly once again be the driver of the recovery for us. So thank you again, Michael.
A pleasure.